Hi, I'm Dave Watts. Welcome to the sixth part of GSA 100, ACLs and Active Directory Groups Connector. In this session, we'll learn about improving secure search performance using ACLs and about identifying group membership from Active Directory using the AD Groups Connector. Our goal here is to get you prepared for searching content from file systems in SharePoint, something you're going to encounter on a regular basis. Access control lists, or ACLs, are the permissions for each file. By default, the GSA doesn't know these permissions and has to use the head requester to find out whether a user can see a file. This default approach is called late binding and can be very slow. Imagine this specific user is only allowed to see 10% of secure documents. When that user searches, the GSA will have to ask the content server for each document, can the user view this? We can imagine the GSA making 100 requests to find 10 that the user can see. We call this ratio of allowed documents versus all documents the deny rate. But if these ACLs can be given to the GSA in advance, it can immediately determine whether a user can see a file without asking the content server. This early binding approach is much faster. If your users have high deny rates, or you want to use features like dynamic navigation or dynamic result clusters with secure documents, you will definitely want to use ACLs. Using ACLs requires additional work before a search runs. First, you have to get the ACLs into the GSA using feeds as shown in the diagram on the right. The diagram on the left shows the default late binding approach. In that model, the user runs a search query, they authenticate against the GSA, and then the GSA takes their credentials and tests them against each document that matches their search from the content server using the head requester. Again, that can take a long time to execute. Performance can be very poor. With early binding, the user runs the search on the GSA. The GSA first authenticates them, just like with late binding, but it will also identify their group membership. There are a variety of ways that we can identify group membership. So far, we've seen one, which is LDAP. So the GSA will identify their group membership, and it will already have a list of permissions. It will have received those permissions prior to serve time from the content server. A mechanism called a feed will push that data from the content server to the GSA. So the GSA will already have that information written down. It'll be able to look it up and immediately know which documents you're allowed to see. ACLs can be sent to the GSA for file shares, for SharePoint, and for some other systems by Google-supported connectors. These ACLs can include permissions for users in groups. They can include allow rules or even deny rules. And they can be set on individual files, folders, shares, document lists in SharePoint, and sites in SharePoint. Typically, best practices for ACLs will require the use of groups rather than individual users. So there has to be a mechanism to allow the GSA to get your group membership in order to use ACLs effectively. In this example, you can see an ACL defined for a document URL highlighted in red. It inherits permissions from a shared folder, and it adds two additional permissions. One is a permit and one is a deny rule to allow this one user, Bob, to access the file, but to deny access to members of the sales group. To use ACLs, the GSA will have to be able to identify the user by name. Therefore, the appliance must be configured to use an authentication mechanism that returns a username called a verified identity, like Kerberos, NTLM, or cookie cracking, rather than just a token that represents the user, like cookies by default without cracking. If ACLs use groups, the GSA will have to find the users' groups that they belong to as well. This can be done using an authentication mechanism as shown on the left, that returns user groups when users authenticate, such as LDAP, cookie cracking, or SAML. Or groups can come from other mechanisms after authentication, as shown on the right. The appliance can use a connector to fetch all groups ahead of time, store them in an external database, and look them up for a particular user after authentication. Or feeds can send groups to an onboard database in the GSA ahead of time, and the GSA can look up groups for a user after authentication. Google provides group lookups as part of the SharePoint, Documentum, and Lotus Notes connectors. Since group membership is so important for ACLs, Google also provides a dedicated connector to get this information from Active Directory. The AD Groups connector regularly fetches and caches groups from AD servers for faster lookup at serve time. It supports all AD hierarchies, including multiple domains and forests, all types of group membership, including cross-domain and forest membership, and domain local groups. One AD Groups connector is required per domain, which should be configured to connect to a specific domain controller within that domain, rather than connecting to any domain controller within the domain. Some connectors are available onboard the GSA or offboard, where you'll have to install them on a server. Which should you use? It depends on your situation. Authentication will likely be silent with Kerberos or NTLM. Each returns a username, but not groups. So you will need to configure an AD Groups connector to get groups from AD. If you're only using file shares, one domain controller, and no GSA or connector mirroring, you can conceivably use a single onboard groups connectors for testing and demo purposes. In production, though, you should install an offboard connector to handle load and allow you to dedicate more memory to the connector if needed, or use an external database. In either case, you configure the GSA to resolve groups at serve time using the groups connector, because the file connector does not fetch or store groups. As shown here, blue lines represent crawl time actions, and green lines represent serve time actions. So at crawl time, the GSA will register the groups connector. The groups connector will go out to Active Directory, get group membership, and then write that information into a database. At the same time, the GSA will talk to the file system connector. File system connector will build a feed that contains the documents and the ACLs. That will be stored in the GSA. And then at serve time, the user will run a query. The GSA will identify and authenticate the user. It will send the user's identity to the groups connector. The connector will return the list of groups that the user is allowed to be in. And then the GSA will use the ACLs to see which groups are allowed to see which documents. The SharePoint connector includes an embedded instance of the AD Groups connector. If you have multiple AD domains or forests, though, you will need additional instances of the AD Groups connector. These can be onboard or offboard, but they all have to be in the same connector manager. This includes the SharePoint connector itself. All connectors within the same connector manager will use the same database, whether it's the internal H2 database or an external database. The SharePoint connector will be used for group lookup, and it will be able to read the database entries made by the AD Groups connector. If you have GSA mirroring, you should install multiple AD Groups connectors for redundancy using a single external database. That will be discussed in our Advanced Windows Environment training later. To configure the Offboard Groups connector, log into the Google Enterprise portal and download the Offboard connector installer. Then extract the folder and run the installer executable file. The AD Groups connector will not be listed as an option. It's bundled with the SharePoint connector, so choose that. Finally, enter a name for the connector manager and specify your GSA host. If you're using the H2 database, when the installer finishes, you're done with installing the connector manager. If you do have an external database, you should configure the connector to use that commonly shared external database. To do this, go to where you installed the connector and navigate the file system. Go to the application context.properties file inside the webinf directory nested within Tomcat. Inside it, you'll find entries that look like this. These will allow you to specify a JDBC connection string and a set of credentials. The connector supports Oracle, MySQL, and Microsoft SQL Server. So enter the database type, host, and GSA admin username and encrypted password in the appropriate place in the file. Then you'll need to stop and start the connector manager itself. This will be listed as a Windows service if you're on Windows, or you can go to All Programs, Google Search Appliance Connectors, and there are start and stop utilities there. After installing the connector manager, it's time to configure the connector. To do this, go to the admin console, content sources, and then connectors. Select your external connector manager and click Add Connector. Select the type of connector and name it. Then click Configure. Edit your LDAP server with the appropriate connection information. You can specify traversal rate and whether to start traversal now or to wait. When you save the configuration, you should get green light status indicator for your connector. To make sure it's fetched or is fetching the groups, you can go to the Logs option under Connector Manager, save and open the log file, and look for the entries listed here to make sure it's processing correctly. If you have issues, you can increase the log level and reset the connector, which will start its traversal from the beginning. Now it's time to configure the off-board SharePoint connector for using an external database if needed, and to specify ACLs to be sent to the index. If we'll use an external database, run the Connector Manager installer again, just as you did for the AD Groups connector, but this time select the SharePoint connector type and specify a different port for the Tomcat service. You'll end up with two connector managers. After you install the SharePoint Connector Manager, go to the file mentioned here, specify the same database settings that you set in the Groups Connector Manager. Then, stop and restart the Tomcat instance. Next, you'll create and configure a SharePoint connector in the admin console. For now, though, we'll only mention that you should enable ACLs. The rest of the SharePoint connector configuration we'll wait to discuss in one of the following modules. The last step is to specify the connector to use for serve time group lookups. Go to the admin console, search, secure search, universal login auth mechanisms, and on the connectors tab, specify either the groups connector for file shares or the SharePoint connector for use with SharePoint. Check the box for group lookup only, give the mechanism a name for administration in the GSA, and save the configuration. Finally, you will want to check your work. This includes checking that ACLs are being fed properly from your file share or SharePoint connectors, and that group lookups are working at serve time. We'll skip the file system connector setup and user authentication setup, as these are discussed in the next few modules. Check the ACL feeds by going to Content Sources, Feeds, and then Download for your connectors, and open the files. To check group lookups after searching results, go to Serving Logs and find your search request. Then look for authentication working, the username found, and the authorization checks succeeding or failing. Let's take a look. For this demo, we'll set up the off-board groups connector along with an off-board file system connector. We'll only actually take a look at the groups connector itself. We'll learn about file system connectors in a later unit. So the connector software has actually already been installed on my machine. So I'll go ahead and run the installer. I'll accept the license terms. Now it gives me the option to install a single connector type or multiple connector types. If I were to choose single connector type, it would list each of the individual options. But what I really want is to have a file system connector and a SharePoint connector. So to do that, they are bundled in one set. If I choose install multiple connector types, I can choose whichever of these I want. And just to make my life easy, I'll choose all three and click on next. These will all be installed within a single connector manager. Now, if I did want to install, for example, the FileNet connector and the SharePoint connector, I would end up needing to run this installer separately several times to install multiple connectors. But since these three will be in the same connector manager, I can do it with just one install. Now, each connector manager is a Tomcat server, and it's going to listen on a port. By default, it's going to use port 8080. If you wanted to use a different port, you could change that. And again, if you were installing multiple connector managers, each one would have to have a separate port. I'll need to put in the IP address of my GSA. To find that out, I can just ping it from this machine, copy the IP address, and paste that into the installer. I need to pick a Java runtime and a location, and optionally I can specify where I want icons to appear. After files have been placed on the file system, the connector manager will register itself on my GSA. So I'll need to put in an admin username and password. The listening port of my admin console, the connector manager name that I want to use. Connector manager 0 is already registered. That's the onboard connector. And since I'm installing a single connector manager that supports multiple connectors, it's a good idea to name them here in the description. Now, even though I didn't explicitly specify Active Directory groups, it comes along for the ride with the SharePoint install. After a few seconds, it will register everything, and then I can exit the installer. There is a little test utility that I can use. I can also use this to start and stop the connector service. So I'll use the test utility, and it says everything is good. Now, if I were to use an external database for this connector, I would need to edit the application context properties file. And you can see from this directory, this is the install directory, GSA connectors 1. Inside there is a Tomcat subdirectory. Inside there we have web apps. Finally, connector manager. And within there, we have a subdirectory called web-inf. And inside application context.properties, there are a whole bunch of entries that are commented out. If I scroll near the bottom, I will be able to see my database entries. So they have entries for SQL Server, for Oracle, and for MySQL. I would simply need to fill these out, uncomment them by removing the hash marks, and then save this file. Then I would need to stop and restart the appropriate service. If I look at my list of services in Windows, I've got one labeled GSA Connectors 1. That's my connector instance. You'll notice it's actually set to start manually. I might want to set that to automatic in production. Now, I can go back to my GSA admin console. If I go to connector managers, I should see two entries here. Connector manager 1. And I can go to connectors and actually register my group's connector. So I'll choose connector manager 1. And then I'll give this a name. I'll choose Active Directory Groups. And then I'll choose to get my configuration form. I'll point this at my LDAP server. Type in the credentials. And then click on Save. Once it's saved successfully, I should see my little green light. I've also set up a file connector. I won't go into the details of that. Now I will take a look at the feeds sent by the file connector. And you'll notice it is adding ACLs. For each document, it's adding ACLs. And if I go under the index and look at index diagnostics, I can actually see some of those ACLs. So under metadata, you'll notice there's quite a bit of information about ACLs, and that's shown in more detail down here. So I can see that I have users and also one permitted group. Now this is really going to be the key because I'm going to log in as a user who's not in this list. I'm going to use Kerberos to log in. And I'll use my domain user account, and as a result I expect to still see documents. Now for that to happen, I need to configure the GSA to use the connector for lookups. So under search, I'll go to universal login auth mechanisms, and I still have my entry from earlier for Kerberos. So again, I'm going to rely on that being there, and I'm going to add a second entry for connector. I still only have the one credential group. I'll call this groups mech, and I'll choose AD1, and I'll tell it to perform group lookup only. After all, that's all it can do. Now I'll click on Save. Now back on my workstation, I'll go ahead and open up Firefox, and I'll search. I'll do a public and secure search, and all of my documents happen to have the word Waterloo in the URL, all of the secure documents from the file server. So I'll use that as my search query. You'll notice I was not prompted for credentials. That again is relying on Kerberos, but I am able to get these documents even though my Kerberos user account may not have permission to these documents directly in the ACLs. Now it could be doing a head request to find these out, so I have to go back and see whether it's really using groups for this or not. So back in the admin console, if I go to my reports and then go to serving logs, I can go ahead and take a look at what's happening. So I can see the authentication process is using Kerberos, but I can also see that there's a separate step for connector authorization, and that is finding those 6 groups. So the credentials were verified by groups MEC. So at that point, I can be confident that groups are the reason I'm seeing the document. This concludes our 6th presentation, ACLs and AD Groups Connector. Thank you for watching, and make sure to watch the other GSA 100 presentations.